You're currently showing as one of four artists in Cristea Roberts Gallery's exhibition, Just What Is It? And it examines the concept and meaning of home. How essential would you say that is to your practice as a whole, if at all?
I think home is present because obviously the elements that come together in my work are all about orchestrating a home and the way that we use space. But I'd say it's more so about the use of space and the idea of place. So all of the works are based on memories and ideas of places that I've visited, and they're kind of reimagined. They're not actually true places. So I find like the word home is quite funny one to kind of attach to them, even though I can see how it's there, but I find it tricky because no part of my home comes into the works. So I think, but they are other people's homes that I would have visited, I guess, but ideas of those places. So it's more about a feeling of the place and an idea of the place instead of it being that exact home, if that makes sense.
But I guess that's where the viewer comes in as well. I mean, I don't know how much you think the viewer complements the work, but they might come in and see something and it will be for them an idea of home.
Totally. I think people like to find kind of a sense of familiarity with the space as well. Or I like that the viewer can look at the space and kind of occupy it themselves, and they almost become the inhabitant, because then I think that they can create their own narrative, and that's more what my work's about, them kind of discovering different sections and different pockets of detail within the work, instead of looking at a space and knowing exactly where it's kind of based on or where it's originally inspired by. So I think that's quite important.
That's almost too obvious in a way. Obviously there is a call for that kind of work, but if it were totally recognizable as, oh, that's such and such a famous house, it doesn't have that sense of involvement in building a narrative.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's why I steer away from using photography too heavily in my resource images and inspiration, because I think when I do that, I become too bogged down in trying to recreate that specific place instead of the idea of a place or how it made me feel in that moment. But I think the other artists in the show, like Sophia, manages to pull in little details from her home, which I also thought was it's quite interesting to see those works show alongside mine, where I'm kind of removing that element of it at the time I was in those works, whereas she's showing little kind of fragments, like a coffee mug or something that's actually hers within the works. And I've never worked like that, but it is quite fascinating to see them kind of shown alongside each other and think about that and the idea of home.
Have you made new works for the show, or were they works that already existed?
So I made new works, but it was quite when I spoke to Helen about it originally, I would say majority of the works that I'd kind of steered towards making before then were architectural spaces and the outside of them and the placement of them within the landscape. So it wasn't so much about the interior spaces, but it made me consider the interior spaces and made me kind of think, oh, because all of these works were inspired by residencies that I went on in Singapore, Japan, and Bali. I wrote down descriptions that when I was over there, I made lots of sketches and I wrote down descriptions of memories of things. So I was actually trying to focus on the senses, the five senses, and write down different kind of experiences through those. So I was trying to address maybe like the sound of something instead. And I think that comes into these works. Like these works were made specifically looking at the senses and how they can trigger memories, and where the titling works through the senses can also evoke that within the viewer, so they can kind of engage in that sense as well.
So do you have the titles? Can you give an example of a title? And do you have the titles in your mind when you're making the work?
Yeah. So that's something that was really new for these works as well, because before I'd always make the work and then find a title that felt appropriate or something that kind of rang true and title that way. But for these, I really wanted to work in a different way, and kind of, because language was so important, because I'd written down these descriptions which were just memories, but they were triggers for me. So they were very personal, but they were just like little descriptions. So each one of the paintings is titled with one of those descriptions that I made, held it in my mind, and then I painted the piece. So one, for example, is called is titled An Iced Flannel Against Bare Skin. So that one was when we were in Bali, and we'd been these architects took us on this incredible tour of all of these buildings that they'd built over there. And it's kind of amazing in Bali because they have no kind of building controls and regs and all of that stuff. So they had like complete creative freedom, which was really fascinating to go and have a look at these spaces. And this particular one was a really hot day, and the people who the housekeepers for the home were there to greet us, and they just kind of met us with these like very cold flannels, and it was baking. We'd gotten buses and we got all our way there, and then they just passed you this, and it was that feeling of like really cold, like textured flannel against your skin when you're that hot. This is like that relief. And I was like, how can I get that across within a painting? Is that even possible? So then in that piece, I'm trying to only paint with really, really warm colours. And with the border, it's like encased in this kind of really warm orangey red sort of colour that's like so... I think that colour just really resonated for me, because I think I try and think of colour in kind of like filing away colours as memories as well. So you're like thinking of language, but also thinking of colour. Mm-hmm. So it's the titles and then the colours for each piece.
But the works are, as you sort of mentioned, architecture, and they are very architectural, quite almost as if you'd studied architecture and they were architectural studies, but you didn't. You studied fine art.
Fine art, yeah, at Falmouth University, yeah. So I have that a little bit. Like lots of people said, oh, why didn't you study architecture? But I think for me, if I studied architecture, I get really frustrated because I don't want to know if they're feasible. I kind of want the spaces to be the opposite of that, and I want people to look at them and first be convinced that they're real spaces, but then realize things are slightly off, or perspective is out, and things kind of like ladders stop abruptly, or something happens, or doorways go to nowhere. And I think that's really important in the work, because I want the viewer to have to question all of those sorts of things. I want them to figure out the space as they go. So it's like working it out, so that for me with the painting, trying to paint it so that it takes the viewer's eye on a journey throughout the piece, but also so that they still question where they are, or where they could go if they were going through one of the doorways or down a ladder, for example.
So can you say a little about you sort of have, but about the process of going from your title and then your feelings and memories and colours to actually getting to the finished piece? Do you do sketches? Do you work straight onto the canvas?
Yeah, so they're all painted on panel, and then I made the sketches when I was on the residencies, but not for the painting. So they're just sketches, like just loose, very, very loose, very free sketches of where I am, but none of those ever kind of translate into finished paintings, because for me, that once the sketch is done, that's the end of it. That's something that's kind of out of my mind. It's like writing. It's the same as writing down the descriptions. It's like the same thing. It's like a journal of ideas. And I think when I plan, I have tried, because I feel like it's a very strange way to work, and sometimes it can be a bit daunting to be like, oh, I don't know what's happening with it. But actually, that's kind of what I love with it, because I have to figure it out as I go as well. It's kind of like the experience that the viewer has with the painting, trying to figure it out, is the same as me figuring it out in my mind as I make it. It's like, I think it's a bizarre thing that I can't it's so intangible, I can't explain it, but it's like something inspires me to make the work, triggers the kind of the thing that makes me go, oh God, I need to paint that. And then it's trying to figure that out as I go. So like there's a painting in the Cristea Roberts show titled Wings of a Dragonfly Against Glass. That one I started off with, again, it was inspired by a space that was in Indonesia where I was working, and it had these big black kind of iron windows, and all you could hear was these dragonflies that would be like, you'd hear this like little clink of like the dragonflies just like brushing up against the glass, kind of smashing into the glass. And it would be like a background sound, and there were so many insects and things that were creating the sound. And I think for me, that piece, I started off with painting the structure in the foreground, just the architectural element. But then I was like, how am I going to kind of get across that this is glass, but also include the the furniture that was in the space, but also feel like you're outside looking in. So it was an interesting one to try and recreate, because it was like, you know, when you're looking through a window and you're on the outside, you're looking in, but there's that split second where you can kind of see the reflection of the outside also within, and your eye takes like 2 seconds to figure out what's going on. I kind of am interested in the idea of that as well, and how you can, whether that can be portrayed.
Have you ever set yourself a challenge and then thought, oh, no, I really don't know how to solve this one?
Yeah, I think it then all of my works are about the architecture and the space kind of being invaded or taken over by the outside and nature. But with that one, there are parts to it where you kind of feel like the outside has really encroached in a different way. It's not just through plants, it's through the foliage. But I still don't know if I hadn't titled it Wings of a Dragonfly Against Glass, whether anyone would look at it and consider that at all.
Okay, yeah. But is that important to you?
I think it doesn't. No, I think as long as people looking at the works feel like they're transported to that space for that moment in time, that's what I think is important to me. I don't need them to engage their other senses to appreciate the work or understand it. I kind of don't want them to understand it anyway. I want them to be intrigued.
Yeah.
I want it to be like, you know, like when you're reading, you get into a really good book, but you're right at the beginning of it and you're like 3 pages in and you don't know what's going to happen, but you're really engrossed and involved in it and you're excited about it. I want the viewer to have that same sort of experience when they're looking at the work. Like they're so new to it and they're excited, but they don't know what's going on with it. That's what I hope for.
Do you ever have to, I mean, you've talked about all the different senses, but do you ever have to recreate things in your studio to help you? For example, bring a scent in that was there at the time?
That is a really interesting thought, actually, because I only focused on those scents for those pieces. It's been like they're like a concentrated 7 paintings where I was looking at it. Okay. I feel like it's sort of done now. I don't think I will revisit the senses.
Yeah.
I just don't know whether that's possible. Without time.
So where else do you look for inspiration? Is it always to places you've been, trips you've been on, residencies, or do you look to other artists? Or
yeah, so many artists, but I like Mama Anderson. I absolutely love her work. She was probably she's my all-time favorite painter. And Peter Doig and Dexter Dalwood. I think Dexter Dalwood is probably one of the first artists I ever looked at who was looking at the idea of space, but creating space in such a way that you have to use your brain and really engage to think about what would be behind anything. So there's the painting that's the Sharon Tate's house, that painting, and it's such a beautiful piece that's like really bright, really beautiful colors, and it's got so many oranges, and it's got this sofa, and you don't realize until reading about it that it is the description from the policeman's like encounter with the space, and actually her body was behind the sofa. But as a painting, it just looks like a really beautiful interior. And I kind of think that in a similar way is it's kind of what I want for the viewer to have to think about what's going on behind scenes. So I like the idea of them sometimes feeling like a film set, like the actual people who once like the characters have just left. They've just left the space, but you don't know where they've gone. There's like kind of maybe imprints from them, but you don't, you're kind of in between. Yeah. And
obviously the title for the exhibition, Just What Is It, is taken from Richard Hamilton's iconic pop artwork. Is he an influence on you at all?
I would say not so much until thinking about his work for like after the show, really, actually. And like in terms of collage, probably yes, because I feel like my works almost feel like they're collaged paintings anyway, because I'm bringing together elements to create the painting, and it's almost like a collage process way of painting. But and possibly more so now. I think maybe the influence is coming later, having like being a part of the show at Cristea Roberts and alongside the other artists. I think I'm now thinking more so about collage going forwards, I think.
Okay.
It's, yeah, quite interesting to think about it in a different way.
Do you feel that having your work shown alongside other artists does change the way either other people see it, or you yourself even see it, or think about it?
I think maybe me myself, because I'm not sure about how other people would view the works together. I'm not sure, but I think it's been really fascinating for me to see their works and hear each Karen, Sophia and Polly talk about how they work. There's lots of similarities that kind of cross over with all of us, and you can see that within the show. But I think my works, it kind of highlights to me that my works don't have as much human presence, or like kind of objects within the space. Lots of my space kind of feel almost dystopian, utopian kind of realms where you're not sure what's going on. I kind of want them to feel like dreamscapes. So the kind of that idea of deja-vu, or like that you've had a dream and you feel you kind of recognize the feeling when you're looking at it as something that you may have once experienced before. I think that kind of comes into play when we're looking at why I don't want them to be totally realistic spaces and things lead nowhere and hover. And I think that kind of helps the notion of wanting them to feel almost dreamlike.
So, but do you think you might start seeing signs of human presence creeping in?
I think so. And I think I'm also looking at, now I'm like, so much of my work was heavily inspired by going away and kind of taking, just like absorbing so much information, new things, whereas I've been here where I am in Guernsey for 2 years now, so I haven't left. So I think I'm actually looking at different ways of kind of resource material. I'm looking at it's interesting because I am looking at more like magazine collaging from magazines and things. And I'm actually, at the moment, I'm working towards Armory in New York, and I'm working in response to Norman Gilbert, a Scottish artist, and he's looking at lots of textures, or he painted lots of textures and patterns. And I feel like texture and pattern is not something that I have been kind of, texture is, but pattern is something that I haven't really addressed very much so in the last couple of years in the works. And I think each Polly and Karen certainly look at pattern and textures heavily. And I think maybe having that, and then also making works in response to Norman's work, it's influencing me and making me just think about every texture, because it's so fascinating thinking about how textures can hold their memories too. Like you can think of a specific throw that would have been on your sofa as a child, and that suddenly transports you back somewhere, and like bringing that into a painting. But I think that's all purely personal and probably very process led for me, because I think painting, all of my works are so heavily about the process, as opposed to maybe not trying to say too much with the idea of texture and pattern, but trying to implement that into the way that I work.
Amazing.